Probably give it just a couple more minutes before we kick this thing off. Let people filter in. Probably give it just a couple more minutes before we kick this thing off. Let people filter in.
Great. So I think I'll get us started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today, everyone watching at home and in person today. My name is Sam Correa. I'm the Community Engagement Librarian here at the Duxbury Free Library, and I'm so excited to be partnering today with the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library. Today we'll be hearing from Ian Spangler, and we're really excited to be learning today about immigration on the South Shore. So we're going to be talking about some, local history, kind of broadly about the South Shore, but I'm really excited to get to hear from them today. So I think I'll pass over to Ian.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. And thank you all for joining us today for this, which should shape up to be hopefully an interesting conversation about the histories and geographies of immigration on the South Shore. So as Sam said, my name is Ian Spangler. I'm the Assistant Curator of Digital and Participatory Geography here at the Leventhal Center. This is the first series, or this is the first talk in an upcoming series that we have here at the Leventhal Center, titled Thinking Spatially. In this series, we're going to be having a number of conversations over the course of the year about the question of how you do geographic research with publicly available data and information. So today, obviously, we'll be talking about immigration, but in the future, we'll have many more of these talks. So please do stay in touch with us and keep an eye on upcoming events if you'd be interested in learning more at any of the future ones. Before we begin, I just wanted to stop to acknowledge the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we can neither forget nor should we ignore. The place that we now call Boston, as well as much of the South Shore, is traditionally the ancestral and current home to Indigenous peoples, including the Mashpee, the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribes, the Nipmuc Nations, and descendants of the Massachusetts and Pokanoket people. Copley Square sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. And moreover, the maps that are in our collections bear witness not only to those histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, the maps that we have and the ones that we'll be looking at today don't simply document these stories, but actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. So through all of our programs and the different kinds of map interpretation that we do here, we encourage visitors to consider how those histories still exert real consequences in the present day. I'd also like to take a moment to spotlight some of our other upcoming programs at the Leventhal Center. Our education team has a really wonderful slate of virtual learning opportunities upcoming, including the Small Bites professional development sessions, these foregrounds teaching about Boston through a social justice lens. On February 5th, we'll be offering an enrichment course designed for students from grades 9 to 12, introducing them to key concepts in mapping and data science, specifically using examples from Boston. So all of these events, as well as more than 10,000 digitized maps, information on research and education programs, and digital exploration tools are all available on our website. You can see the link right there. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you do have any questions about those programs. Here I'll also note that the staff here at the LMAC, myself included, are not necessarily experts in immigration studies or the local histories of the South Shore. My goal today is not really to provide a comprehensive and complete account of either of those things, but rather to equip you with the tools to conduct any more specific research that you want to do on your own, using our collections and beyond. In the process, we'll be able to look at some hopefully really interesting maps. And along the way, I invite attendees, whether you're there in person or in the Facebook and YouTube chats, which are both being managed by our wonderful public engagement coordinator, Megan Nally, to share your own knowledge and ask questions if you do have any. Lastly, I just want to note that the Leventhal Center is an independent nonprofit, and our free programs are supported by donors like you. So if you like today's program and want to support our work, like our K-12 programming, our preservation of historic materials, and our efforts to bring modern mapping skills to the wider public, do consider making a donation. Even a small donation of $2 to $5 really goes a long way and helps advance our Free to All mission. And you can find the link right there. So with that being said, let's turn our attention to the topic at hand, immigration on the South Shore. I'm going to go ahead and pull up some slides for you. And we'll have some strange nesting of the video for just a moment. So immigration on the South Shore. This is obviously a complicated and detailed topic. But in order to start understanding it, today I just want to begin with a very basic question. First, we'll be talking about what is the South Shore, actually? Where does it begin and where does it end? And why does asking that question matter for how we understand processes such as immigration? How do these boundaries end up being fundamental issues in the practice of geography and mapmaking? In the sort of second section of this conversation, we'll turn towards the issue of immigration itself a bit more directly. What regional trends in immigration led to the patterns that we're familiar with today in the greater Boston region and the South Shore? How can we explore those trends using maps and charts and all sorts of other documents? And what kinds of data sources capture this information? In doing so, what kinds of information do those data sources leave out? And finally, I'll finish up today by discussing how you can access some of these tools and some of these kinds of historical documents on your own, whether it's in the context of immigration or otherwise. So let's go ahead and jump into this question of defining the South Shore. Here's a map of Duxbury from 1833 showing boundaries of the town. The cartographer, his name is John Ford Jr. He also made another map like this and made it for Marshfield. So we've got this pair of maps from South Shore towns. In addition to depicting property ownership and some topographical features, you can see the hash marks representing elevation, and all of the text on these maps is largely highlighting, this small black font is largely highlighting property ownership. In addition to those things, these maps also delineate what is Duxbury or Marshfield and what isn't. Right? But where do those boundaries come from? How do boundaries like this get established to begin with? And why will that end up being an important question for asking questions about immigration? So, in the early 20th century, the state of Massachusetts ordered something called the Topographical Survey Commission to standardize geographic survey points that marked out the borders between different municipalities. You might be familiar with the process in the Midwest, right, which includes counties and townships that are based on a rectangular grid survey. The lines in New England towns are a little bit different. They're defined by this sort of connect the dots pattern that often references landmarks. So this survey is from Duxbury in 1899 and reveals landmarks like where Cedar Swamp crosses a pine brook, or from the flat rock to several trees. And those points, those landmarks, end up becoming something called town corners. You can see some of these corners on the left here in kind of greater detail. And on the right, you can see how they all end up getting stitched together to make a full view of the town boundaries, right? This data is also digitized. So we've actually made a web map at the Leventhal Center where you can see all of these town corners populated and pulled together to create a boundary of a town in a sort of accessible web mapping environment. You can explore those town corners where each blue dot here represents a corner. And if you click on it, you can get directed to one of the digitized images of what those town corners originally looked like. I'm starting out here because something that stands out to me about this data set, and I think we can call this a data set, it's an archive of information about how boundaries got put together. What stands out to me about this is how arbitrary these points are. Right? A pine tree or a heap of rocks end up connecting the dots, and suddenly you have a town. But of course, those arbitrary boundaries have lasting impact on all sorts of decisions, like economic ones about who gets taxed and where that tax goes, what kinds of programs and services the residents of a place have access to, and by whom they're politically represented, right? These are all questions that are ultimately decided by seemingly arbitrary decisions about how lines get drawn. And this ends up impacting things like immigrant populations, right, and how these are counted. So this map, just a map that is building out of census data from 2019. This map shows one of the key data sets that we can use for assessing immigration, the US Census. So we're looking here at the percentage of the quote unquote foreign-born population at the block group scale. Block groups are just small spatial units, right, that the census uses to subdivide different areas. And a key thing that I want to point out here is that the block groups must conform to the units in which they've been nested, right? Block groups conform to town boundaries, which are represented by the red lines. So when we're looking at these maps of immigration, some more maps that we'll look at today, and analyzing and researching how this stuff has changed over time, we should bear in mind that there are these material histories that sometimes can be as arbitrary as a pine tree in a field, that lead to the origins of the ways that this geographic data gets represented. Town corners that were defined in the 17th century still affect how people get counted today. Right? So this issue of how maps and map makers can manipulate boundaries for different purposes is a really important part of the current exhibition that we have at the Leventhal Center, Bending Lines. So while block groups, of course, and things like town boundaries might seem fairly mundane, these sorts of issues can also have international impacts. This is a map showing the relative positions of the Rio Grande over about 50 years. And it captures a lot of dynamic change, both in this body of water, but also in international geopolitics. We can zoom in a bit for some greater detail here. On the top, you can see the legends that shows the years where the river has meandered. And on the bottom, some greater detail on the map itself. This map was made by the International Boundary Commission, formed by Mexico and the US in 1889. And it was tasked with surveying changes in the river, right? According to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which established the Rio Grande as the Mexican-American border. The boundary followed the deepest channel of the river, and the boundary between the two countries would adjust with any slow and gradual change to the river. However, if the river changed course quickly, if the change was rapid, the border would not change with the river and would instead correspond to the 1852 survey. So between the survey in 1852 and the creation of the commission in 1889, the river wandered constantly. The position of this river changed as much as a mile at certain points along the boundary. And the shifting of those waters ended up creating two sections of land, the Chamizal Tract and Cordova Island that you can see right here, right? And these were both tracts of lands that were on both sides of the river at one point or another after the creation of the border. Right? So bearing in mind the ways that these lines we put on maps can inform much broader decisions about governance and politics, let's jump back to the South Shore for a moment. So there are all sorts of different ways to understand this region, right? On the left is a depiction of the South Shore from mass.gov. On the right, we just have a similar representation of the South Shore, but from a different authority, the South Shore Chamber of Commerce. Which one is a better approximation of the area? And why are they so different to begin with, right? One is much more inclusive and one has fewer towns accounted for. Another example of this is we can turn to something like Boston Magazine, right? So these are kind of silly, more playful maps. The one that we have on the left, this is a web map that Boston Magazine put together that crowdsources opinions from readers about what constitutes the boundaries of the South Shore. The results are predictably all over the place. People have wildly differing opinions on what boundaries begin and end this region. And on the right, the pictorial map accounts for these county towns in the same way that the Chamber of Commerce does. And so all that to say, we can interpret this space in a lot of different ways. This is one such way that we can approximate the South Shore. Right? Some counties we feel much more, or some towns we feel much more strongly and confidently that these are included in the region, and some we're less sure about. And again, this might seem like a sort of mundane or unimportant question for things like immigration. But moving forward, these towns are formed and founded by material decisions that carry over from one era to the next. And so even in this time of modern, computer-based map making, the legacies of, survey points with stones and trees are always present. So this sort of leads us into the next section, thinking spatially about immigration. And I want to begin this by emphasizing that how people move through space is impacted greatly by boundaries that are both real and symbolic, right? I want to start off by looking at this map from 1929. It's by a cartographer named Beulah Locke Sherburne as a starting point. It's a good reminder that the South Shore, like all of Massachusetts, must be foremost defined as land that was expropriated by European settlement during the first wave of Anglo immigration to what we now know as the United States. So in this map, we can see the towns of Plymouth, Duxbury, and Kingston pictorially marking key events in Massachusetts history. This is a map from the David Rumsey Map Center. They mark events like the passage of the Mayflower, the founding of many churches and parishes, and even the marriage of Ralph Waldo Emerson, you can see down here. So something that is consistent through all of these images is that they tend to ignore critical parts of the historical record, right, in favor of a certain type of history, a white settler history. That, of course, doesn't mean that native names are completely absent from the map. If we pivot up to Duxbury Bay, which marks a ship called the Matakeesit, this name is taken from the Matakeesit Band of the Massachusetts people, and it highlights a recognizable phenomenon across the Commonwealth, basically the adoption of native names and imagery throughout the Massachusetts landscape. This includes symbolic things like the state seal, as well as physical sites like Mosquetsupomic, which is a historic mound, Arrowhead Hill. In this image, right, it's easy to understand the recognition of sites like these as a positive form of native inclusion in our collective memory. But as MIT historian Mark Jarzembek has argued, the inclusion of different kinds of Native American names and places in local citizens' geographies was designed to obscure just as much as acknowledge. In his view, efforts to make Native history visible in Boston and its environment, including the South Shore, has mainly amounted to lip service. For example, things like the Massachusetts Enfranchisement Act of 1869 has decreed that all Indigenous people are entitled to all the rights, privileges, and immunities of citizenship. Also removed the possibility of tribal territorial control. So this 1869 Act was the culmination of a process that began long beforehand, during the first wave of European immigration during settler colonization. In the first draft of this 1614 map of New England, the surveyor John Smith had labeled place names in native Algonquian. He brings this map back to Charles I, who demands that he change the names to English ones, right? And so that's where we get this version of the map that we see today, where things like, Plymouth, London, Point George, right? These are sort of invented place names. And this is a classic example of the ways that maps have the power to create territory just as much as they do to merely represent what's already there. The displacement of Indigenous people is unfortunately an origin story for this country. So bearing that in mind, let's proceed to some of the other ways that immigration has unfolded in the centuries following these early maps of European immigration to the South Shore. This map here depicts some of the flows of movement around 1862. This is kind of in the height of the first wave of immigration to the US and particularly Boston and the South Shore. This is a map by a French engineer, by the way, named Charles Joseph Menard. Menard pioneered in this map and some other ones that we actually have on display at Bending Lines, a technique for representing the movement of goods and people using these flow charts, right? So this was not a particularly common way of representing movement on maps before Menard's use of this, and it required that he distort the shapes and sizes of different places in order to account for the different size of these lines that are showing movement. At any rate, you can see here, zooming in on the legends, that by 1862, there were really two populations, primarily immigrating to the US. This is the English and the Germans. English on this map includes Irish, and in the mid-19th century, the Irish were far and away the most populous immigrant group in the US and in Massachusetts. Now, while maps like this are useful and certainly fun to look at in understanding the ways that immigration has changed over time, there are lots of other fantastic and more detailed historical resources that we can use for understanding immigration. This woodcut, for example, by Winslow Homer, excerpted from a popular periodical called Ballows. This depicts the arrival of Irish immigrants in Boston in 1857. So on the left, he has the new immigrant family being welcomed by their Americanized immigrant relatives on the left, or on the right. Many Irish folks had been immigrating to the U.S. in the wake of the 1846 potato famine, and Boston was a key destination in this region. So one way of examining this movement of Irish immigrants into the U.S. is by looking into historical marriage records. These are made publicly available by the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office, and they're kind of interesting to look at just to see what you can find in these details. Many of these records contain countries of origin for the bride and the groom, and you don't have to look particularly hard in this 1873 record to find a pair of Irish surnames. Right? Sayers, both from Ireland. Right? We can even look at some certificates themselves to get more detail. And again, it's not too hard to find folks who have immigrated from Ireland or other countries in these records of marriage. This is just one kind of granular way of asking the question, how have populations been changing and how is immigration changing over a particular period of time? This method, of course, is probably better suited for something like genealogical research, right? Than instead of understanding broad questions and patterns. So to get a sense of some of those broader patterns and dynamics, we can take a look at something like this. This is an 1890 census graph showing pie charts of all the US states at the time. In 1890, almost 15% of the country's total population consisted of foreign-born immigrants, and an additional 33% were children of immigrants. So those numbers reflect the significance of immigration generally to the country's population growth, especially during the late 19th century. The graphic was kind of innovative for its time, right? And it consists of these pie diagrams that show for each state the percentage of foreign-born people from Canada, China, and 12 different European countries. Massachusetts pie diagram shows that the largest group, again, came from Ireland, while Canada holds the second position. Some South Shore towns in particular have an Irish heritage that's directly related to this wave of immigration, especially Scituate, with which many of you may be familiar with. By 1870, there were about 100 Irish families living in Scituate. This influx of immigrants was due largely to the Irish potato famine in the 1840s and the Irish mossing industry. Dave Ball from the Scituate Historical Society has a great interview with Smithsonian Magazine detailing this history. Carrageen, also known as Irish moss, is a type of seaweed that grows along the coast on the surface of undersea rocks, and it's very useful in a variety of processes that range from the production of gelatin capsules to wool treatment. So Dave Ball notes that the harvesting of this moss was very much a family affair that was driven in the mid-19th century by lots of chain migration between Irish families that were coming to the US and landing in Scituate. Irish mossing flourished through the 19th and 20th centuries, and while it dipped off in the 1960s and is mostly practiced today, as far as I can tell, as a sort of historical tradition rather than an economic engine, it is still an interesting reminder of the place's Irish heritage and the ways that those old processes still have an impact on the landscape and the way that we understand demographics in a region today. So especially later on, during the 19th and 20th centuries, we start to see the issue of immigration becoming a hot button problem that divided Americans, right? It wasn't all Irish mossing. In this census table, which details immigrants to the US by country of origin, I just wanted to highlight a couple of key boxes here. On the right-hand side, you can see the numbers of immigrants from Ireland spiking in the wake of the potato famine, right in this middle box down here. And just over to the right of it, we can see German immigration spiking after a failed revolution. Those are the events that precipitated these surges in immigration. On the left, we see the opposite thing happening. Between 1921 and 1925, Asian immigration begins to decline, dropping off steeply after 1924. So what are the events that lead to this? What are the ways that this breaks down regionally in an area like Boston or the South Shore? What are the reasons that we might explain and understand these in hindsight? So while the woodcut I showed you earlier was a sort of romanticized understanding of immigration, these political cartoons capture some of the less savory attitudes towards influxes in Irish and German immigrants in the 19th century. Again, these are populations that really dominated in Boston and the South Shore. On the right, we have a stereotyped image of an Irishman and a German running down the street, leaving behind this chaotic scene at the polls. They're each wearing barrels labeled Irish whiskey and lager beer with obvious implications. And they've each got a hand on the ballot box, implying that these immigrant populations are going to move to the United States and steal the vote. On the left, we've got a pretty similar concept. In this boat, the entire Galway poorhouse is being shipped towards the US on a boat. It's dirty, it's overcrowded, and obviously poor, right? Implying that the Irish immigrant population is undesirable and needs to be curbed. These kinds of sentiments were not uncommon in the 19th century. And, of course, anti-immigration propaganda continues to have resonance with debates over immigration in the US today. Eventually, anti-immigrant feelings would turn into anti-immigrant policies, which heralded what some people call a restriction era of immigration in the US. These policies actually have some origins locally, right, in Boston, specifically thanks to a partnership between 3 Harvard alumni, Prescott Hall, Robert Ward, and Charles Warren. In the late 19th century, they formed an organization called the Immigration Restriction League. There's a great piece in the Boston Globe about this, which was a lobbying policy group, right, that was dedicated to the restriction of immigration, specifically immigrants with a quote unquote low stock background to the US. So these are grounded in racism and eugenics, and they ultimately get their first immigration bill passed in 1917, which among other things, includes a literacy test, a tax on immigrants, and broad exclusion from a region called the Asiatic Barred Zone. This cartoon on the left here depicts the passage of the Emergency Quota Act, which is just a few years later, a follow-up to the 1917 Act, enforcing that no more than 3% of the foreign-born population as of the 1910 census could enter the US per year. So for example, let's say there are 50,000 Asian immigrants living in the US in 1910. That meant that in 1922, no more than 3% of that number, or 1,500, would be admitted into the country. In 1924, that was adjusted to be even stricter. So these immigration restriction acts remind us that the census, while a useful historical tool, also has the capacity to be used to exert power over people. At the same time, or at the time of these restrictions, when they're being passed, the US Census Bureau has hired thousands of census enumerators and clerks to collect and organize and tabulate the data that's needed to complete the 1920 census. The decennial census was and remains an enormous undertaking. It's one that required residents to provide answers to their enumerators' questions and for census workers to make choices about how to interpret responses or silences in the record on the census schedule. Nearly 60 pages of instruction booklets were issued to these enumerators in 1920, people who were tabulating information. And they included instructions on things like who's included in the census, right? How much time is allotted to complete each district? And the order in which city blocks are supposed to be canvassed. Right? The 1920 census actually required enumerators to record answers to newly added questions about naturalization status, English proficiency, and the mother tongue or language of customary speech. The Census Bureau's preoccupation with questions about immigration was also illustrated in instructions for reporting the place of birth, right? So altered borders following World War I made that really hard. Specific instructions were given to enumerators to record the region or the city of birth in particular places instead of the country. Austria, Hungary, Germany, Russia, Turkey. These are places where capturing the country of origin might provide faulty data, if you're a 1920 census enumerator. All the while, the restrictive immigration legislation that's passed in 1917, 1921, and 1924 would use numbers from previous censuses to establish quotas on who from those very countries could enter the US. You can see in this table from the BPDA that sharp dip in 1920 from the immigrant quota policies that were passed. And this graph just shows the foreign-born share of the population in the US, Massachusetts, and Boston, respectively. Boston and Mass, largely as a result of Boston, both have a greater share of immigrant populations than the US on average. And we can dig into this a little bit more using this great app from bostonindicators.com. And this will bring us a little bit back to the South Shore again. This is a Boston-based research center that has put together a really handy little web map. And the link is right there at the bottom. We can share that in the chat as well in case you want to explore this on your own. The map allows you to explore census data on a variety of indicators at the census tract level or the town level for Greater Boston, and that includes regions that we basically understand as the South Shore. So compared to Boston, the South Shore has had fairly low numbers of immigration, although Quincy and Randolph rank pretty high. The nice thing about this map is that it doesn't only show us a variety of topics like foreign-born population, home value, and race, but it also includes the ability to compare the percentages between 1990 and 2017. So that change over time is a really powerful part of what the census provides the tools for us to understand about some of these topics. That said, a few aspects of this map are not all that sufficient for questions we might have about immigration on the South Shore today. For example, this map only shows us patterns at the level of the town. It doesn't give us more detailed information at the block group scale, which makes it kind of hard to meaningfully distinguish between patterns within towns as opposed to patterns between towns. So in order to answer questions like that, this brings us to sort of the last section of this talk, accessing and analyzing historical information. Right? The range of topics that I've talked about today have basically been informed by just a few key sources that you can all jump on at your own convenience. First, Digital Commonwealth. Second, our own collections here at the Leventhal Center. And third, the US Census. And I've talked a little bit about all of these, but I want to dig in to some examples right here. These are all publicly available sources that range from demographic data to maps, charts, and other archival items. First, Digital Commonwealth is a nonprofit organization that is hosted by the BPL. They provide resources and services to support the creation and management and distribution of different kinds of historic materials that are held at many different partner institutions across Massachusetts, including libraries, historical societies, museums, and so on. Digital Commonwealth has over 200 member institutions from across the state, and it provides access to thousands of images, many that I have used today, like this one, right? This picture of the immigrant arrival at Constitution Wharf in Boston. So these are all accessible. And this one in particular, you can see the periodical includes text from the issue in which it was published. So second, the Leventhal Center's collections. We're home to about 250,000 different cartographic objects, which includes flat maps, rolled maps, different kinds of navigational devices, and about 10,000 of those are digitized. You can see them online right here in our digital collections portal, and you can access the entire collections through our website at leventhalmap.org/collections. We've also created a variety of digital tools for exploring historical maps, and these are also available at our website. We're particularly fond of AtlasScope. It's the tool up here on the top left, which allows users to easily compare historic maps of Boston to modern geographies. And finally, the US Census website provides easy access to all of the censuses, both historical and modern. By navigating to their website, you can click on this advanced search button and toggle through a series of filters that track down information on something like immigration, right? So using this data, we can make something like this, right? A map that shows the foreign-born population of the South Shore across the whole geography that we looked at earlier. And this gives us some finer indicators than what we saw in that Boston indicators web map earlier. Looking at some of this data, it's clear that the block groups from Quincy to Randolph are still the greatest, home to the greatest population of immigrants today in the South Shore. But looking at this data in more detail and finer detail gives some interesting insights that we can't have when we just look at the town level. For example, much of the coastal South Shore ranges between maybe 3 and 11% in terms of the immigrant population, but there is a little enclave in northern Plymouth and eastern central Carver. Another interesting point is that this little chunk here, this enclave in Hanson, Pembroke, and Halifax, right? We wouldn't be able to identify the ways that these block groups blend together and kind of suggest, maybe there's a community here that defies the boundaries of the towns that contain them. The foreign-born population is a partial way, right, of understanding immigration in any place. There are also lots of other indicators that we can grab from the census and beyond that might speak better to this, might give us answers about what kinds of cultures or linguistic markers characterize particular areas. And it's always important to ask, when you're thinking about doing this kind of geographic research, what the purpose and the goal of making such a map is. Who is it going to benefit? What kinds of research questions are guiding this form of inquiry? And at the Leventhal Center, this is really the kind of question that we are excited to help you think about. If you would be interested in making a map like this and doing some kind of historical or archival geographic research that involves different sorts of census data and geographic objects, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to think through ideas, assist with problems in making your map or formatting your data, and any other questions around organizing your research. So that is all I have prepared today. I'll go ahead and break out of the slide share, and maybe we can jump back in. We have about 15 minutes for questions, if you all have any questions about what I've kind of walked us through here. And I'd love to bring Sam back in if you're interested in jumping on screen to maybe monitor in the room too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ian. I really, really appreciate your knowledge and your research that you did for this presentation, and I thought it was super interesting and super engaging. So thank you so much for your research and your work. And if anyone has questions, even the folks who are in the room with me, I'd be happy to kind of read them off to Ian, repeat them to Ian. Happy to discuss what we just learned and what we just talked about. Hi, so we do have a question here from someone in the room with us today. She's asking if you have any recommendations if folks want to learn more about immigration on the South Shore today. I know you mentioned the census data, but do you know of any other kind of resources that folks might be able to access that where they could learn more about the current state of immigration in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple of organizations that do work in Massachusetts kind of broadly, immigration advocacy groups and refugee coalitions. MIRA is one that I will drop. I can drop this in the chat. They put together a lot of different reports and do advocacy work around issues related to immigration and refugee resettlement. And I think that there are a lot of groups like that that are local to different towns across the South Shore and again in the whole of the Commonwealth. So those are always a great place to start, just to see what kinds of work are being done, right, in the areas that you're interested in learning more about.
Thank you so much, Ian. And any things that links that are shared in the chat, I can also send out later on to those who registered via email and such. That's really great. Thank you.
Yeah, and if anybody has questions about finding those links, if we went too fast through any parts of the talk, please feel free to follow up. I'm happy to share any of the images, any of the links, any of the documents that talked about today.
Thank you so much. I actually had a question for myself. I would be curious, you showed us a lot of those interactive maps that, people can kind of move and explore and show different time periods and that sort of thing. Is that what you're seeing in kind of the future of map making, especially in an online environment, is those interactive portions with like almost layered history?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Sam. It's hard to say what I think the direction the future of map making is going. I mean, people are always making maps in all sorts of ways that are static and dynamic, and it ultimately depends on what the end goal of the product is, right? If you're using, let's say you're using some kind of cartographic or geospatial data as evidence in a legal case, right? You might not necessarily need a fancy networked database-driven web map to make the arguments that are important to something in that context. But for tools like the ones that we put together here at the LMAC and what a lot of, in my experience, folks end up finding useful in their everyday lives, I do think generally those kinds of web-based map making platforms tend to be more engaging and more playful, right? Because you can only do so much with static modern choropleth maps showing the ways that information is kind of organized across different geographies, right? What really makes those interesting is being able to compare different data points across those geographies. And so, like I said, we have some examples that we've done at the Leventhal Center, but there are plenty of really interesting ones out there related to immigration and beyond. I'll pull one up real quick that I can put on the screen. This is just a fantastic project that was done at, I think, Texas Christian University, that some of you may be familiar with, but it's called Mapping Immigrant America. And it's a full map of the entire US represented with different dots that approximates to different numbers of people, right? Depending on what scale you zoom. So you're zoomed in a bit more, the number drops. You zoom out, the number gets bigger. But we can go over to, the South Shore and kind of look at the way that those dots are distributed. And again, of course, like Quincy and Randolph really are highly represented as diverse immigrant communities here. And as you go up and down the South Shore, it tends to fall off a little bit. But in Plymouth, we have an enclave. This is probably that enclave that I pointed out on the choropleth map that I showed earlier. So these are really interesting tools that are engaging and playful. And I think, just to your question, Sam, hard to say what the future of map making is, but definitely a fun way to engage that kind of information.
Thank you so much. Looks like we have a question. I'm sure you can see that too, Ian, but I just wanted to point it out.
Yeah, so we've got a question from Lynn, who's interested in historical information about immigration from Quebec. Lynn, I mentioned those marriage certificates, which I didn't talk a lot about today, but depending on the scale and scope of what your research questions are, that could be a really helpful place to start, just looking through some of these marriage records to see, how prevalent immigrants from Quebec and Canada more generally were during a particular period of time. I know that Menard map that showed immigration flows in 1862 was Canada was highlighted second, right, as the second most populous immigration source. So you might find some dates to kind of draw boundaries around, and then look at something like marriage records to see where people's place of birth is originating from. We also had let's see, a potential answer. Yeah. So one of our other our assistant director Emily has just chimed in our chat, and I'll drop this link into the chat here. McGill University has a great set of maps that you can explore, and might have some good answers on questions around Quebec immigration to New England at this time. Yeah, so hopefully that's helpful. Yeah, Mike, that's a great question. I think that in the greater Boston area and in New England, Boston was really a lodestar, a pretty guiding force in terms of where folks were landing when they immigrated to the U.S. Obviously, New York is a big one too, but But yeah, I think in New England proper, we would see a lot of folks coming into Boston. Any other questions before we start to wrap up? Looks like we might have made it to the end. What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, I think so. Well, thank you so much, Ian, and everyone at the Leventhal Map Center for such a great talk. I know I learned a lot about maps and immigration, and it's been really exciting to get to have this conversation with you today. Like I said, I'm Sam from the Duxbury Free Library. For anyone who might have popped in a little bit later, I'm the community engagement librarian. And if you have any questions, for me, for us, I can definitely pass them on to Ian. Later on after this talk. You'll also probably get an email from me later on with some of the links that were mentioned in the chat today, in the discussion, and just some more info about the Leventhal Map Center. So thank you so much again. Ian, anything else you want to add on?
No, I think I would just like to thank you and the folks at the Duxbury Free Library for partnering with us and hosting such an interesting event. If you all have a minute, we would love for you to fill out the survey that's linked there in the chat, and get your feedback on how we can, on what you liked, what you think could be improved from presentations and organizations like this. But yeah, I otherwise hope to hear from anyone who has more questions, and again, would love to chat with you about all of your GIS related web mapping questions and research projects. If you're ever interested, don't hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much again, Ian, and have a nice night, everyone. Thank you for joining in with us virtually.